I talked to my colleagues and my boss and I said, at what point do we not just affirm whatever somebody is saying they identify as? Their response from my team was that that's not a problem. If the client doesn't think it's a problem, then we basically champion them for knowing who they are and we just support them in that. It's not impacting their functioning. It's not an issue. Just move on to talk about something else. And I was like, that doesn't sit right with me. I don't feel like that's true. I think that if somebody is so wounded by life that they can't even identify as human anymore, then we need to give some attention to that.
You must be some kind of therapist.
Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Tamara Pietzke. You might be familiar with her Free Press article in which she blew the whistle on gender-affirming care in Washington back in February. She's done a few interviews since then. Tamara is a mental health therapist, specifically a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Washington. And although she had no idea what she was getting herself into as someone who's not particularly political, she stepped into a scandal earlier this year by raising concerns about what the heck is going on in the mental health field when it comes to this expectation the therapist should do nothing but rubber stamp people's gender identities and recommend that they get on hormones and surgeries. So Tamara's another brave whistleblower I'm happy to feature here. Those of you who are long-term listeners know that I'm not exactly the sort of podcaster who jumps on stories when they're hot and fresh, but I do love to speak to whistleblowers a few months or even years later just to find out how it's going and talk about their reflections on the issue. So I'm really glad to finally be able to sit down with Tamara today. Tamara, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So
it's good to be here.
You've had quite a journey, and for those who've read your article or listened to your other interviewers, they know that this was not easy for you to take this risk with your career being a whistleblower in a blue state, that you're a single mom, you have a family to feed, but that you just felt like you had to speak out about the injustice that you were seeing. So for anyone who hasn't heard your story, let's sort of do a recap of these events that unfolded over the past year or so.
Sure. So I think that the first thing that happened was when I had my client come in and say that they identified as a wounded male dog. It was a 16-year-old. And after that was back in about a year ago, March of 23. And so after that, I talked to my colleagues and my boss and I said, at what point do we not just affirm whatever somebody is saying they identify as? And the response from my team was that that's not a problem. If the client doesn't think it's a problem, then we basically champion them for knowing who they are and we just support them in that. If it's not impacting their functioning, it's not an issue. Just move on to talk about something else. And I was like, that doesn't sit right with me. I don't feel like that's true. I think that if somebody is so wounded by life that they can't even identify as human anymore, then we need to give some attention to that. But I didn't do anything with that information. I just kind of sat with it, let it sit in the back of my mind. And then this past September, we were informed that we were going to have a mandatory gender-affirming care training. And I had some concerns about the wording. I didn't even know what gender-affirming care meant. I had not heard those three words together. I assumed I knew what it meant, but I had to do research. I was concerned because they said it was a mandatory meeting, which our meetings up until that point hadn't usually been. They were optional. And so this was the meeting was happening right after Labor Day. And so I spent that whole weekend just doing research after the kids went to bed. And I was trying to figure out what is real here? Are my concerns about this training that we have to go to valid? And I sent out a bunch of emails. Anyone that I saw who wrote an article about their concerns about this, anyone that was an organization, I was like, please tell me if I'm right here, because I'm not going to go to this training and sit through something that is going to where they're demanding that we do things that are going to hurt our clients. I'm going to tell them I'm not going to go. But if I tell them that, because it's mandatory, I'll probably lose my job. And so I want to make sure that I'm not wrong. And so I sent out this email and somebody responded and was like, if you don't go, they're going to just render you irrelevant. You have more power if you go. And if you ask these questions, you're not wrong. And so I went to the meeting and I asked some basic questions about why we're just, moving forward with gender affirming care when other, countries are pulling back and saying, maybe this isn't the right approach. Why are we suddenly speeding full steam ahead, mandating this of our clinicians? And I was met with just so much hostility. My colleague said, keep politics out of this. That I didn't even understand what that meant at the time. I was like, what do you mean politics? I didn't say anything about the president. I didn't know what they were talking about. And they said, you are doing harm to people. You're like violating the oath to do no harm. Just you're part of the problem. You need to check your biases. The host of the meeting basically told me, we're not going to take time to have these conversations. So you need to basically just stop talking. And so after the meeting, I was so upset. I couldn't even work that day. I just like called in sick and I was like so distraught. And then my boss reached out to me and was like, that wasn't the right time or place to ask those questions. And I was so mad about that because I was like, okay, I had 122 of my colleagues at that meeting. When would be the right time and place to ask these questions when nobody else could possibly be aware that there's another side to the story that you're not telling us, like behind closed doors where you can like silence me and shush me and make me go away? Like, I don't think I did anything inappropriate. You guys just don't like what I'm saying. And so after that, I continued to ask some questions just in like a more appropriate format, like via email with my boss and the person who orchestrated the meeting. And they were like, I need you to understand. My boss never responded really, but the meeting host was like, I need you to understand, like, we're not going to agree on this. Like, you're wrong. There's no reason why somebody's mental health would impact their gender identity. This is multi-care. This is best practice. This is a multi-care standard. I need you to be really clear about that. And then I had a 13-year-old client, mostly like extensive trauma history, on the spectrum. Like in our sessions, they would just like rock back and forth, barely even communicating verbally, just like scrolling on their phone, showing me like just really violent animes type stuff. I had only met with them 3 times, and I saw on their chart that they had an upcoming gender clinic appointment, and so I asked them about that, and they didn't even know that they had one. I was like, "How are you feeling about your upcoming appointment?" And they said, they didn't know. And so I kind of was just like monitoring that. And then after their first appointment with the gender clinic, dad asked me for a letter, basically. He said, and I looked at the note and it was like, in order to start testosterone, get a letter from your therapist. If your therapist isn't a gender affirming therapist, make sure you see somebody who is, because a non gender affirming therapist can cause damage and harm to you. So I was like, I'm not going to write this child who I'm first of all, they're 13. Second of all, they have so much else going on here. I'm not going to write them a letter to start testosterone. And so that I, again, thinking that I had like just the perfect example of why we shouldn't just be rubber stamping everyone who comes through, my boss contacted the meeting leader and was like, hey, this person's wanting testosterone. And in my silly little brain, I thought they'd be like, well, Tamara, use your judgment. Of course, we don't always want to start kids on hormone therapy. But they didn't say that. They said that I have to do it. And when I pushed back, my boss came to me at one point and was like, I want you to know this has gone above me. Like, the person who led the meeting has reported you to risk management. And so the client is going to be taken from you and given to somebody who will write that letter. And so I was like, well, that feels crappy. Like, I care about this person, my client. But then I also thought, okay, well, now I can talk to risk management and maybe we can finally get somewhere on this issue. And so I met with risk management multiple times, had them go through the client's whole chart, wrote this big extensive letter about why, even according to SOC 8, like, this client should not be started on testosterone or anything else. And risk management still decided that I was the risk and that I was basically incompetent as a, gender distress, gender dysphoria clinician. And at that point, I was like looking for other work. I was like, I can't work for an organization or a company that I don't respect. So,
And then you got another job.
I did. And then I got another job 2 weeks before the article came out. And then my third week there, the article came out and completely blindsided me. My boss at that place called me at like 7 o'clock that night and was like, you're just not the right fit for this position, and didn't really give any additional reason. And so I lost that job.
And now you are a single mom building a private practice from scratch.
I am, yeah. I'm grateful to be able to provide care the way I think is best and meet the needs of the community. But it's been really hard too, to just um, build that caseload and connect with teenagers who maybe want a more affirming therapist. I think that word is being skewed. I definitely consider myself affirming in the sense that I don't want anyone to feel judged or walk away from an interaction with me feeling like I'm trying to change them. That's not my approach at all. But I don't think we should be fast tracking kids to medicalization.
Yeah, it's very disturbing that the minds of young people are essentially being poisoned to make them closed off to help, right? That they're being fed these lies about, like you said, a non-gender affirming therapist can cause damage and harm to you. So they have this really narrow set of expectations about what help is supposed to look like. And that help looks a lot like sort of permissive parenting, but at the level of a therapist instead of the level of the parent, right? Rather than authoritative parenting. We know that, part of the responsibility of a parent is to give children what they need, not necessarily what they want, right? To give them boundaries. But there's sort of this expectation that if I want candy and ice cream and video games, you give me candy and ice cream and video games. And same thing with the gender stuff. These kids they're asking for boundaries, and you picked up on that in your countertransference when you describe this interaction with the child who said, I identify as a wounded male dog. You felt that sort of cry for help in that. Now, going back to that moment, it's like the kid uttered the magic words, I identify as. If you use that phrase, or if you say anything about the word gender identity or gender identity, anytime those words get uttered, a switch gets flipped, and a young person is now, they've entered a machine that is designed to carry them through this process like a conveyor belt. And some young people say those phrases knowing that because of what they've learned online, and they think that this is what they want, and it's this is how to ask for the candy and the ice cream and the video games. But some of them don't. Some of them don't know that their choice of language is opening up a whole world of possibilities and closing down a whole other world of possibilities for what help might look like. And so when you were recounting this moment, and I've heard you describe this on other interviews you've done, I identify as a wounded male dog. It makes me think, how different would that young person's life have been if instead of saying I identify as, they had said, sometimes I feel like I'm a wounded male
Yeah.
dog.
Hmm. My approach to that would have been entirely different. I would have wanted to know what that meant. But when you say identify as, it's like, I guess you don't touch that because you could lose your job or your license, you know?
And part of what makes me so angry about the way the system is set up right now is that young people are saying all these things that are ripe for symbolic exploration. Now, sometimes they're saying them because they're coming from somewhere, right? Like when you describe a phrase like I identify as a wounded male dog, very similar to, but in completely different meaning from I feel sometimes like a wounded male dog. But all these phrases, phrases like the idea of being born in the wrong body, well, that's an unfalsifiable metaphysical claim. Gosh, it's symbolically meaningful, though. I think a lot of these young people, they're just consuming so much online propaganda, if you will, that if you were to prod at that, you wouldn't get anywhere. But I think for some other young people, that even if it is coming through peer and media influence, there's still something there for them. Sort of like how, I don't know about you, but when I was a teenager, song lyrics were very meaningful for me, right? So that artist was putting something into words that I related to or felt. So then you kind of latch on to these things that other people say. And then you're like, I'm trying to get at a part of my own experience this way. And all of these things are so ripe for symbolic exploration for those clients who have the, enough sort of insight to go there, which, and you've seen some of the clients who don't, some of the ones who are autistic, nonverbal, just really lacking in insight. But therapists are blocked from being able to go there symbolically and explore what that might mean to them. And it feels like we're ignoring people's cries for help, ignoring their symbolic attempts at self-expression.
Yeah. And what about the poor parents who are like, my kid is in distress. They are identifying as another gender or whatever, however they identify. And they think, I finally found a therapist who can kind of weed through this with us and figure out is this true? And then the therapists are told basically if the client is saying this, then gender affirming care is suicide prevention. So we're telling the parents we're not doing any sort of I don't know, is this, does this child is this child's dysphoria going to last into adulthood? Is it just something they're going through right now as a teenager? Because teenagers experience a lot of different, they're navigating, figuring out who they are. Instead of like, we're not able to actually help. We're just saying like, oh, okay, so this child is saying that this is what they are. And if we don't do this, then we're putting them at increased risk for suicide. Like that is so abusive to the parent too, to be like, well, if you don't do this, your kid might kill themselves. Like that's horrible. And that's the mentality that we're feeding people and kids. Like I had a child come to me and say that I tried to like talk with him about my approach on this and was like, so you care more about my physical health than my mental health. You want me just to kill myself. And I'm like, that's not like, they are being fed this like script where if the adults in your life don't allow you to do this, then you might die. And if somebody told me that at 16, if somebody said, not to trivialize this, but to use the example of like sweets or whatever, if somebody was like, yeah, if you don't get that donut, then you can tell your parents that you're going to kill yourself because they just took whatever joy from you. Like I would be like, sure, yeah, let's absolutely run with this because I'm being told that I'm at increased risk for suicide if I'm not getting this thing that I think that I need, you know? I just feel like, and I tried to explain to the kid, I'm like, I absolutely care if you feel like you want to do something to hurt yourself. But that is a different conversation. Like, that is, I want to help you so that you feel life is going to throw lots of curveballs at you. I don't want suicide to ever become an option for you again in the future. Like, let's figure out why it is that that's an option for you right now. Like, let's treat that as something separate than the gender dysphoria and gender distress. Not to say that the gender distress isn't causing you a lot of suffering, because it obviously is, but like, let's make sure that we can help you feel like when hard things happen in the future, your brain doesn't automatically default to that being an option again,
Exactly.
And
right.
yeah, we're not allowed to do that.
Whether the actual motive for that young person is more along the lines of what you described, that their brain goes there, suicide is an option, or whether this is more of an interpersonal manipulation, frankly, that if I don't get what I want from someone else, I can always threaten suicide, like taking that person hostage by using their worst fear against them. Either way, yeah, let's distinguish that form of mental distress or that form of interpersonal problem. But let's unpack this, because I've unpacked this in a few different places, but every now and then I get a new request like, can you explain this a little bit more clearly, Stephanie? And so I'm really glad that you brought this up, Tamara, because I think as two therapists who've both been trained in so-called gender-affirming care and ended up blowing the whistle on it, I think we're in a good position to unpack this. So step one, here's where I want to start. Suicide ends a life. And so if our concern is bringing down suicide risk and suicide rates overall, which is definitely part of the professional responsibility of every mental health professional, then we need to consider lifetime suicide risk. And we now have studies showing that the lifetime suicide risk of people who go through with these drugs and surgeries is, one recent study found, about 12 times higher. And I'm happy to explain, maybe I will in a little bit, all the reasons why, at least how I'm able to put two and two together, saying here's everything we know about suicide risk factors and protective factors. And now let's overlap that with what we know about so-called gender-affirming care and figure out why the suicide rate is higher in this population. So I'm happy to unpack that, but I just want to say, as sort of a guiding principle, that I think we need to consider the impact of our actions on a person's lifetime suicide risk. And it seems to me incredibly foolish to say, I'm worried that a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old is going to do something to harm themselves during this time in life that, yes, they're impulsive, but also they're under their parents' watch. That is a really safe place to be. Living with people who love you and want to protect you is a really safe place to be. And to say, I'm so worried about this person who has the safety net doing something impulsive now, that I'm going to risk what their future looks like 10 or 20 years from now when they don't have that safety net, when they aren't living with their parents anymore. That, for me, is incredibly foolish. Plus, the way people talk about this, the way therapists talk about this to the parents and to the youth in front of the parents, or to the parents in front of the youth, in a way that implies that A, the youth have no agency, Like, oh, suicide is just going to come take them over, like what? Like suicide is just a demon that possesses your body and makes you do things, is like, or does the youth have agency here? And then does the parent have agency? Because as professionals, you and I have, I'm sure, both been to plenty of trainings on dealing with suicide risk. And we know where to draw the lines, how to assess the severity, the level of intent, whether there's a plan, whether there's access to means, whether that there's anything contributing to an excessive sense of urgency for that person right now, whether there are any things that it could increase their impulsivity, like alcohol use, right? We're trained to assess all those things and to know when do we say, I don't know if you're safe, I think you need to go to the hospital, versus when do we work with that individual or work with the family to say, here's how we can keep you safe at home. And here's, where we draw the line where now you need to go to the hospital. So when a person has these active, engaged parents and they're a teenager, there's very few things most parents wouldn't be willing to do to keep their kids safe in that situation. So it's this way of, oh, your kid's just going to kill themselves, as if the kid has no agency, as if the parent has no agency to say, not on my watch, not under my roof. No, I'm here, right?
Yeah.
I just want to give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. And I feel like whether they're using that, well, I'm just going to kill myself then, as a manipulative tactic, or whether or not that's a thought that they have in the back of their mind as like an option, I do think you're right in the sense that, like, I mean, in a lot of senses, but that they're in the safest place right now and they're under their parents' roof to build those like distress tolerance and coping skills so that if they struggle with this in the future, if they end up medicalizing and then regretting it or struggling with their mental health down the road because we never actually dealt with any of the underlying issues when they first came in, then they have those skills, hopefully. I feel like, yeah, let's do therapy with them while they're under their parents' roof, where their parent can keep them safe, can keep an eye on them. Let's help them eliminate suicide as an option so that when they're an adult, hopefully they can reflect back on what they learned, when they were in a safer, under the parents' roof.
If you're looking for a simple way to take better care of yourself, check out Organifi. I start every day with a glass of their original green juice powder mixed with water. It contains moringa, ashwagandha, chlorella, spirulina, matcha, wheatgrass, beets, turmeric, mint, lemon, and coconut water. 100% organic with no added sugar. It's the best tasting superfood supplement I've ever tried. It's super easy to make, and it makes me feel good. Organifi also makes several other delicious and nutritious superfood blends, such as red juice, immune support, protein powders, a golden milk mix, and even superfood hot cocoa. Check out the collection at Organifi.com/sometherapist. That's Organifi.com/sometherapist. And use code sometherapist to take 20% off your order. I'm gonna push back on this idea that, because I like it in theory, the idea that even if a person chooses to medicalize, that there are things that can be done with exploratory therapy where that person doesn't just consider suicide an option. I do want to say, though, if a person is already, demonstrating very low distress tolerance about psychological distress in the absence of any, physical pain, injury, or anything like this, right? And then you add the serious health problems that can happen after months or years of medicalization, that's just a whole new level of challenge. And also, I think, it's like they have to use the suicide argument in the gender-affirming care world because we know that these medical procedures are life-shortening. And so, like I have a friend who's going through cancer treatment right now, and she is not somebody who normally would choose to put a lot of chemicals into her body. She's pretty natural in her lifestyle, but she's going through chemotherapy because the alternative might be death, right? Like you really have to weigh, like, if the alternative is death, then yeah, I'd rather, put poison into my body and shorten my lifespan, but at least give myself a future because that's the path of least harm. So with all this gender affirming stuff, I think they have to put it that way. They have to frame it like the alternative is death in order to justify that they're actually shortening people's lives.
Yeah, let me clarify. I don't think what I meant was that if we can do therapy with them when they're teenagers and they're under their parents' roof, if we can like prevent them from medicalizing, then we're helping them. We're dealing with the underlying issues, the anxiety, the depression. We're building those coping skills, hopefully the distress tolerance skills, and we're setting them up for more success as adults. If they, as adults, choose to still, you know, transition, then hopefully some of those, well, first of all, hopefully their brains are more developed than if they had it transitioned as teenagers or young people. And, but hopefully the skills that we provided them with as a teenager will help in some aspect. But that, I guess the goal or the dream would be for them not to feel like they need to transition because we're able to do good therapy with them when they were young and under their parents' roof and they were um, more safe from the option of suicide because they had somebody keeping an eye on them, you know?
Yeah, and where you're coming from makes sense to anyone who's familiar with the actual research on and who has that mindset of let's protect people's health and well-being. Let's always choose the least invasive options. But it's like there's this kind of glaze that comes over people who are indoctrinated into the gender stuff, and
Yeah.
you were met with some stuff that was really shocking to you in terms of the ways your colleagues responded. And something I've heard you say on a previous podcast reminds me of something I've heard myself say a lot, which is that one of the most shocking things to me is that, see, when I first learned about detransitioners, when I first learned that there were people who claimed to be harmed by this, was 2020, fully at least 3 years after I'd been taught the gender affirming model. And for me, the moment I learned anyone was being harmed by this, I felt like I need to learn everything I can. I need
Mm-hmm.
to pause on working in this way. And I went down that rabbit hole. And to this day, the most shocking thing is that there are therapists who don't have that reaction like you and I both did.
Yeah, it is shocking to me. And then I think, what is that? Like, is it like this cult mentality? Is it that you're just trusting that the people above you are making the right decisions and you're just not looking into it yourself? Like, what is that? I can't understand that really. Like, why are you not exercising any critical thinking skills? In my experience, the higher up people aren't necessarily trustworthy or motivated by doing what's best for the client. So we have to use our own brains to ask ourselves, like, what is happening here? And
Can
is
we
this
actually
something that I can agree
speculate?
with?
Because I'd love to know. Because I mean, I hear you saying I don't know. Like it could be this, it could be that, but I want to kind of speculate into that further because it's such an interesting phenomenon. What happens when these people who,
Sure.
they've gotten into a career because they love caring for and helping people, generally pretty empathetic and open minded, pretty kind and understanding. Maybe some of them, if they do marriage and family therapy like I do, maybe some of what they do is help people hear each other over difficult subjects, right? So this unlikely population therapist becomes nasty and closed-minded when it comes to, the type of concerns that you've raised. So I guess I've had one idea come to me recently that I think some of it has to do with tribalism and that they've been taught that there are these bad people out there who oppose transgender rights. Let's say it's being framed that way. I have, a whole like spiel on what transgender rights even means. Like, what rights do trans people have that the rest of us are that other don't have? That anyway, you hear what I'm saying. But they've been told that there are these bad people, right? And in their mind, there's like this whole demonized other category of people. And then someone like you, who they had in the good people camp in their minds, becomes that voice saying something that triggers an association with what the bad people ostensibly are saying. And then it's like, I just imagine their amygdalas are firing like crazy. Like it's like some kind of chain reaction kicks off in them of fear and anger where they're like, oh my goodness, this person I trusted, this person I thought was one of the good people is actually one of the bad people. Almost like they just discovered that they let the Trojan horse into their town or something. And now it's like, everything is firing on all cylinders. And they're like, how do I get the bad person out of my good people group? You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an interesting and probably, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. When I've asked this question to other people, they've said, for them to hear you, for them to give any weight to what you're saying, they'd have to admit within themselves that they might have done something that harmed people.
Totally.
And they can't handle that thought. And so it's easier for them to villainize you. I understand less the like angry, I hate you for speaking out against this, because I think that even if I hadn't been in this position that I'm in now, like if one of my colleagues who I trusted was like, I have some concerns about this, I'd be like, let's have a conversation. Like, absolutely, I want to know what your concerns are. I understand more the gray area because, again, if I'm trying to imagine myself, like, if I didn't know anything about this world, or even just the me of like a year ago, right? I didn't know anything about this world. I had this mentality of like, okay, there's these people over here who feel very strongly about this. And then there's these people over here who feel very strongly about this. And I don't know enough to know like why this group over here can feel so strongly and this group over here can feel so strongly, and how they're not, one of them has to be right, right? Like I don't know why how they can be on opposite sides of the argument and so convinced of their rightness. And so I feel like I'll just sit somewhere in the middle and believe that maybe sometimes this is okay for people to do, and maybe sometimes it is harmful to them. And hopefully the powers that be will figure out how to decide which children should be medicalized and which children shouldn't. I can see myself, if I didn't know anything, being like, it's more comfortable to be in the gray where like they care a lot, but they care a lot too. And I think everyone cares about people's well being. And so let's just like let people do what they're going to do. And I just think it's more comfortable sometimes for people just to be like, I don't know, let everyone just make their own decisions, you know, and just kind of like keep themselves out of it. But when you're a therapist, when you're being asked to write, not even asked, told that you have to write letters or you're going to lose your job or your license, then you have to ask yourself, like, what is happening here? What am I doing? Am I, and I remember the thought that like really got me, motivated me in the beginning was like, I can't look at my 13-year-old client in the eyes today and know that I am writing a letter where potentially the them of 5 or 10 years from now is going to look back and say, why did my therapist let me do that? Why did they not ask any questions? Why did they look at me and smile and nod and go along with everything I was saying? Like, I can't, as a caring person, live with myself if I am setting my clients up for a future where they're struggling with cancer or bone density issues or infertility or any of the other things that we know are associated with these, you know, early medicalizing, you know, processes.
That position that you described of the sort of, let's say, the humble moderate, right? The person who sees that there are people on both sides fired up, knows that they don't have all the answers. And there's an assuming of goodwill too that I appreciate about that position, which is because I noticed the way you framed it was they care a lot and they care a lot. But that's not how most people in this argument are framing it. They're not saying, I see how much you care about this, right? And that was one of the things that you've expressed being really shocked by, is that your colleagues couldn't at least acknowledge, I see where you're coming from, or let me take a look at that, or I understand you're trying to protect people. It was that the moment you questioned any of this, you are now bringing politics into the workplace, which you didn't know you were doing, right? It's like they're the radicals. And you're doing great harm to people, right? They love that idea of harm. So now that you're in private practice, I imagine that you have parents seeking you out, wanting you to work with their young people, but you've said that there have been some difficulties with this since you are Googleable as a whistleblower, even though your stance is it's a lot gentler, more middle of the road than, you know, people like me who I say that I've basically boldly declared my stance. I don't think there's ever a time the doctors should take healthy people and make them sicker. I don't care what age. Like, that's my stance. You've come forth in such a gentle way, a moderate way that makes space for other opinions. You clearly come across with a lot of intellectual humility. And yeah, it sounds like from your experiences so far, ever since you became a whistleblower, that there are young people who just wouldn't be willing to talk to you. Like they have certain expectations of what a therapist is supposed to do. And can you describe, you know, obviously within the limits of protecting patient confidentiality, but can you describe some of the obstacles that you've encountered or trends you've noticed?
Yeah, so I have had a number of parents reach out to me and they're like, I'm so glad I found you. My child is struggling with this issue. It's so hard to find a therapist who's not just going to, you know, rush to affirm them. And sometimes I feel like if the kid in question is still just trying to like figure out who they are and is just like this is just a thought in the back of their mind, and they're willing to see me. They're willing to like just kind of like, well, yeah, let's just like explore this together. I'm not in any hurry to like medicalize, but it's the kids who are like, I want a letter right now. I want to start, you know, testosterone or estrogen or whatever right now. Those children do not want to see me. I met with somebody and they cried the whole way through our appointment, like I thought, well, yeah, I get that they're angry at me, but certainly we can like have some sort of back and forth dialogue here, and they can see that like I care about them. Like I'm still just really like living my way through this and learning so much as I go because I'm just so naive. Like I really thought like, but they'll see that I care. And that's not how it played out. And I talked with Sasha Ayad about this actually, and she's like, you have to see it as like a religious experience. If somebody told you Jesus never walked on water and you're a Christian, are you gonna hear that? Or are you just gonna stick with this belief that you have so innately inside of you that like, yeah, but he did, you're not gonna be able to say anything to convince these captured children that like you're not the enemy. And so that's been really hard because I desperately want to help them. I hear when they talk to me that there's so much else causing them pain and distress. And I remember asking that client that I just mentioned, the one who like cried through our whole session and never saw me after that. Like angry cried, not sad cried, mad at me cried. I said, "What is it that you want from a therapist? Like what ideally are you looking for?" And they said, someone to write this letter for me, someone to help my parents get on board with the letter. Like that's what they want. They don't want therapy. Then you're not asking for therapy, right? Like you're asking for someone to help facilitate the process to medicalization. Like that's not, I am not a good therapist if that's all that I do for a client. So it's been hard. It's been hard to like know how to help people. It's been hard to know how to help parents, and it's been hard to know how to help teenagers who are just so, it's like talking to a wall. It's not like talking to a person anymore. I thought certainly we can connect, and it wasn't that way.
Yeah, it requires, I think, a combination of ego strength and humility to be able to be vulnerable with a mental health professional, to come feeling distress and knowing this person has tools for helping people like me when we're in distress, even when we don't fully understand how we got here or how to get out of this. That's a really vulnerable thing to do. And I'm sure you've had many wonderful experiences, as have I, in the role of therapist with people who did have the ego strength and the humility to come to us saying, I don't know what my problem is. I know I have a problem, and will you help me? That's a really, really brave thing to do. But I think the problem that you're pointing out is that these young people have a huge set of expectations built up already. They have a strong, compelling story that they're very bought into about why they feel the way they feel and what is going to help them. And so they come saying, whether or not they verbalize this, the message that their behavior is sending is, I know exactly what I need and what you, Tamara, are and are not capable of, right? It's like there's no receptivity there. There's no, maybe this is like a wise, compassionate person who can see something that's in my blind spot and that it would actually really help me to look at that blind spot. Maybe I would get new insight. There's none of that, right? There's like, your job is to do this, which is actually, when you think about it, it's a really cynical worldview, right? That everything, because if I'm, 13 and I'm thinking this way, like there's very little I know about life. There are very few skills I have, right? And to think like this is the be all end all. If I don't get this testosterone, there's no point. And it's like, in one simple statement that a youth might make to you, that it's like there's so much to unpack there.
It's like before, multi-care wouldn't let me unpack it, and now the clients themselves often seem to be incapable of going there. Which is again like, I don't know. Let's just let their brains mature and develop. Let's just create this like safety net, this bubble for them to just figure out who they are. I just wish that like medicalizing before 25 was not even an option, so that these kids could stop thinking that if they say this or if they do this, then they'll be able to transition. Like, what if they just knew that like, okay, I can't drive till I'm 16. I can't potentially transition till I'm 25 when my brain's fully developed, right? Like if they just knew that, then we have this like time to kind of work with them, and then no one has to be the enemy. Like I don't have to be the enemy about whether or not I'm going to write a letter for them, because that's not even a topic of conversation. Like, I don't know. That's just me dreaming of like a world where we can actually help these kids, you know?
So I've been working on this course that addresses the psychology of this issue. And I've been thinking about something pretty related to what you just said. I've been looking at, various psychological phenomena like the sunk cost fallacy, the hot cold empathy gap, all these things as they pertain to ROGD youth. So I think that, are you familiar with the phrase the hot cold empathy gap?
No.
Okay, so there's this episode of Hidden Brain podcast that explains it really well. I think the episode is called In the Heat of the Moment. It's like maybe from 6 years ago or so. But it's basically that not only are we bad at predicting how other people will act in various high stakes situations, we are actually pretty bad at predicting how we ourselves will behave in a situation in which our heart is racing. So that's why it's called the hot cold, because we're in a cold or cool, calm, and collected state of mind, and we imagine what we would do if we were in a situation that triggers, the fight, flight, or freeze response.
Sure.
And so, like a classic example is that a majority of women surveyed said that if they were sexually harassed at a job interview, they would speak up. And then it turns out in a study where they had participants unknowingly were actually sexually harassed at a job interview, and this was the study, and none of them spoke up. They all froze. Right. So that's kind of like a classic example. And so I think between that and the sunk cost fallacy, the idea that when we've invested a certain amount of time, money, energy, hope, and especially something as precious as one's sense of identity, if we've invested a certain amount in something, we will keep fighting to try to make it work and to defend it, even long past the point that it's become clear that, we're essentially throwing good money after bad. So I think with all of these
Sure.
things, even this idea, and you don't have to agree with me, and I'm not trying to openly challenge you or criticize your ideas. I'm just showing like a different side of the story, that even if like there were that barrier at, where nobody could do anything medical till 25, it's not like there's zero harm in a young person going from age 16 to 24, spending all those developmental years reinforcing those neural pathways by, iterations of thousands, if not millions of thoughts, feelings, and actions on repeat, reinforcing the sense that I need to be seen as the opposite sex in order to be happy. This is who I am. Like, yeah, the neuroplasticity of that time in life is pretty powerful. And so I'm sort of combining like a lot of ideas here, and I probably sound all over the map, but I think that, even with that boundary in place, there's still harm in social transition. And there's still harm in there
Oh,
being a
sure.
world where therapists aren't allowed to do their job, a world where
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't disagree at all. Not at all. I think that that absolutely needs to be in place. But yes, I think that social transitioning for kids to like just like hyper focus on I'm this opposite, I'm this other gender, or I'm this or I'm that. I do think there's definitely harm in there. I think there's a social contagion piece. I think that we need to monitor what kids are seeing on their phones, because if all they're watching is stuff that's reinforcing that, then that's not doing any help, or that's not helping them at all. But as a therapist, I'm like, man, if I could do therapy with these kids, if
yeah.
they would just be like, okay, yeah, let's talk about these other things going on. But they won't even talk about them because all they see is that they're having this gender distress and they needed a solution for that. So if I could like be like, okay, yeah, I hear that. Let's set that aside for just a minute. Like, let's just set it aside for a minute. Not that it doesn't matter, but let's look at this other stuff here that's going on, because we can't really do anything about that till you're 25 anyway, right? Like, I think it would just be so helpful to be able to do therapy with them, because right now we can't. As soon as somebody comes in and says I identify as a different gender or whatever, like, well, we don't do therapy with them anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like, because anything that you do or anything you ask can be seen as like, um what is the word? I think it starts
Conversion
with a C.
therapy.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I've been accused
Conversion
of. Yeah.
therapy. Yes. And you're like, but no, I'm just trying to ask, like, hey, you are 16 and you have your whole life ahead of you. Why do you feel like a dog? Like, I need to know. And why I'm a wounded male dog. Like, let's explore that a little bit. Like, I very much want to know. But if you ask that, then they can say you're not being affirming, you know?
Well, on that note, I think a direct quote, if I have this straight, that was used against you is, there's no reason why someone's mental health would impact their gender identity. So that's that
Yeah.
it comes back to this unfalsifiable belief that there is this thing, this sort of independent, ineffable thing called a gender identity, and that there's just no correlation between a person's, magical insights into who they really are and the things that have happened in their life. And if someone gets the gender bug, if it occurs to them that they might be trans, then that's just a fact about who they are.
What about like the fact that 80 to 85% of young people who are allowed to progress through puberty normally often resolve their dysphoria, end up being gay oftentimes? Like, what about that? Like, why are we not allowing, if there's no way for us to like know who is going to be the 15% or whatever that's going to persist into adulthood with this, if we have no way of knowing that when they're teenagers, why are we not just creating the safe space for them to figure that out, to go through puberty normally, and then either decide that this is something that they're going to persist in or not? Like 80 to 85%, right? That's the
Well,
statistic.
and I think it's even worse than that, because I don't remember what year that study was from. I know what you're talking about. And I think that was from a time when it wasn't this massive widespread social contagion. There wasn't 30% of a generation identifying this way. And it was mostly the people who had gender dysphoria were the gender atypical gay kids, or the proto gay kids, the kids who would grow up to discover they were gay. And so, yeah, I think the statistic matched that time. But now, with the social incentives and disincentives that this younger generation is facing, there are all these kids who are actually by nature pretty gender typical, by nature heterosexual, and they're getting swept up in it too, because the last thing they want to be is cis. So I think it's even worse. I think, like,
Maybe. Do you think it's like they find a group that, because oftentimes there's an ADHD or autism component, right?
right.
Do you think it's that they find these people who accept them and are also, struggling maybe with their gender or their identity, and then they just like, it's the social contagion piece because they find a group that like accepts them, that they feel like they fit in with, and then they all sort of like struggle with this thing together?
I think it's
Or
even
maybe
worse
not
than that.
even. Really?
I'm so skeptical of everything at this point. I mean, the idea of acceptance. I think it's the idea of acceptance, right? I think
Okay,
it's
sure.
more like it is, the relationship between that and true acceptance is like the relationship between genuine love and love bombing, right? It's
Okay, yeah, I
it's
get
this
that.
it's this it's the trump card. It's the now you have to accept me. And it's the fact that with a lot of these kids being on the spectrum, they can't read social cues. And given what I do, so I mean, now all I do is I do consulting with ROGD parents. And, a lot of the parents of autistic boys specifically, I notice a lot in those stories that the boys are so unaware of people's social cues that they really really cannot tell the difference between people liking them and thinking that they're pretty and seeing them as girls versus people just being polite. I've heard some incredibly naive statements, like, a boy with autism saying, well, now that I've grown out my hair and legally changed my name, everybody will see me as a girl. It's like, no, like, you know, like, so I think it's this like, um it's more like the love bombing version of acceptance.
Sure.
It's the fantasy of acceptance. It's being rewarded for something. It's having a trump card. It's feeling powerful. It's going from the underdog. I mean, like, I'm thinking about, like, I was a punk kid, and I remember like going from being like nervous, shy, awkward, geeky kid who'd been bullied to having this overnight transformation and entering, I think it was ninth grade, like with my like Operation Ivy t-shirt and my short spiky blue hair. Like, I remember that when you feel powerful, you're like, screw you, world. Like, I'm,
Yeah, you can't touch me.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And like, I mean, it's ironic that there's this huge social justice belief system associated with this stuff. And one of the things that people who are into social justice are most fascinated by is the notion of power. And here with all these young people, I think there's a fascination with power. I think they're learning just how powerful they can be. And I mean, you know about how adolescence is the second rapprochement, right? The echo of the developmental stage of toddlerhood. And it's like, let me see what I can get away with. Let me see how far I can push. But they're calling out for boundaries.
It's a lot. It's like, what do we do? Where do we go from here? How are we going to fix this? I don't know. people have asked me that, and I'm like, I'm still living my way through this. Like, I'm still figuring it out as I go and trying to like understand like how we even got here in the first place. I wish that I had an answer. I wish that I could be like, well, this is what needs to happen, but I don't know. Like, how do we undo the damage that's been done?
I think a lot of young people are just going to have to get through this phase of life unprotected because all the people who are trying to protect them, our hands are tied. And some of the time our hands are tied because of the belief systems adopted by the young people. Like you said, like there are young people who you are there, you are a diamond in the rough, you are like one of a handful of people in the state of Washington who's actually safe enough to refer these young people to for counseling, but they have unfortunately already been fed so much, frankly, propaganda that tells them that someone like you, I mean, it's ironic because like you're so soft spoken and you have such like a gentle, sweet face. Like I'm sure you're not accustomed to people being threatened by
Oh,
you.
no,
Like
not at all. That's a very confusing notion.
like I at least have like a resting bitch face, so I'm accustomed to people being like intimidated or threatened by me, so that like when this happened I was like, yeah, what else is new? But like you look like you couldn't harm a fly, and this is all very, I mean, you didn't even know how political this was when you stepped into it. You didn't know that you're going to be labeled like a far right MAGA extremist for saying these things. And so
No. And I wouldn't have done anything different anyway. The more that I realize how corrupt the system is and how they're working to silence people with concerns, the more I feel like I need to scream about this issue. Like, because I really thought people were just trying to do the best that they could. And that at some point, a person would hear me, like risk management or my boss or somebody would hear me and we'd be able to like have a conversation about this. I was so naive. Like, I really thought that I just had missed all the years before of therapists navigating the same road where they were like, no one's going to listen to you. Like, I was not aware of that.
you know, I remember when I was going through it back in 2022 when I was under investigation for my board, I had a similar fantasy. Like I had a fantasy of at least some kind of climactic moment where I got to sit across from a table with my board members and like have a conversation, right? But everything was either a phone call. I had two phone calls with the investigator, or it was over email. It was all very depersonalized. I never had an interaction with any licensed mental health professional on the board. Look, I'm not complaining because the board let me go. Like they found no evidence of wrongdoing. I have faced no disciplinary action, but for me the writing was on the wall. I saw like I walked away from that on the one hand grateful for it to be over and for me to walk away with my license intact, but I think I also felt like this is only going to get worse. I'm only going to become more outspoken on this issue. And, you know, and every time someone like you comes forward with a story where you said the most innocuous thing and you were giving them every opportunity to prove that they even lived on the same planet as you did, right? You're like, so wait, just to be clear, right? Like you gave them every opportunity and they were like, no, 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 no. No, we rubber stamp people through a process of medicalization. That's what we do here. You know, you're like, do I need to like get my ears checked? So after going, I mean, so it's like every time I hear one of these stories, it's like this is a war. And so for me, I think I needed to prove to myself that I would be okay if I lost my license. And so that's part of what's driven my continuing with the podcast and stuff. It's like, well, then I need enough people who know and respect where I'm coming from that I'll have some kind of safety net if this continues. But it has taken away my ability to just be like an anonymous therapist. So have you been grappling with like how to, I mean, since you're pretty new to private practice, like how to market and position yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm like, do I go to pediatrician offices? Because like, where are they going to stand on this issue? Like, are they going to see me as the enemy? I mean, you just don't know, like, and I love working with people who want me to help them, whether the issue is gender distress or something else. Like, I don't want to I feel like oftentimes people reach out to me because they see me on podcasts or something. And so then I'm working with a lot of like teenagers who are reluctant to see me. And I am happy to still see them if they want the help, because I know like I know that they're safe with me, that I will do therapy with them. I really want to help them. But like, am I just going to become this person who works specifically with this issue because a lot of other people in the state? I just feel like I don't think I'm making sense because I'm trying to word it in a way that's not going to make me sound. I want to still do therapy with all issues: depression, anxiety, trauma, all the things. I love that I've been in this world of getting to have a voice against this issue and provide a safe place for kids to get treatment, whether they're experiencing gender stress or something else. But when I market myself, are people going to be like, oh, hey, that's that whistleblower person. We're not going to like hand out her flyer to these people because that's all she does is like tell kids they can't transition or something. You know, like I don't want that to just be, I don't want my clientele to just be children who are okay with seeing me, but who are experiencing gender distress.
Well,
Am I making
yeah, I
sense?
mean, I really hope that it ultimately pays off and works out for you, because I think that as much as there are people who would reject you because of this, there are also people who would specifically seek you. I mean, do couples
I hope
counseling?
so. Do I do what?
Couples counseling?
I do, yeah.
Okay.
Couples, family,
I
whatever,
mean,
yeah.
there are, I'm sure, people looking for individual therapy, couples counseling, things, who have just lost so much respect for the mental health profession over what we've done, like how egregiously we have failed on this issue. And and then they find themselves in these situations where they're like, I probably really need to go to therapy, or we probably really need marriage counseling, but I have so little trust in this profession. And then just the fact that you have called out the insanity on this issue means that you are one of the trustworthy people.
Yeah, I did actually have one. Now that you say that, I did have somebody reach out to me and they said, I saw you on this podcast. I'm not struggling with gender or anything, but like, I trust you more because of what I heard you say. Like, I know that you're going to do good work and I want to see you. And I'm so grateful for that, for the ability to be like, some of us are still asking these critical thinking questions, you know? It just is infuriating to me because I'm like, even if I was wrong about this issue, which I am not, I'm screaming like, I think we're hurting kids. Why would a good person not be like, let's talk more about that? Like, if you're so quick to be like, no, you're transphobic or you're this or you're that, then you have something to hide or protect. We're not having like a dialogue anymore. Like, even if I was wrong, if I thought kids were being harmed, I should be screaming it until somebody heard me, right? Like, does that make
Yeah,
sense?
no,
Like,
it's
even if
shocking
I
that
was
it's
wrong.
it's so hard to get someone's attention on. Okay, like here's an example. If my fiance was driving and I said, "Stop," he would slam on the brakes because he trusts me
Yes.
enough, right? That like, what is there an
Yes.
animal on the road or something? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and you would think that there, just amongst adults in general, that there would be enough of an ethos of trust that if any adult who hasn't disproven themselves by, I don't know, like having a criminal record, aside from a handful of like criminals and creeps, the rest of us, like that there should be license to say, I'm worried a child is being harmed, and that other adults would
Yes.
say, what's happening, right? It's just like this
Yeah. What do you
basic
mean? Yeah.
ethos, whether or not you
Yes.
yourself are a parent or work with kids in any capacity, like it's just part of the ethos of adulthood that like you look out for children. And
Sure. If you say somebody's drowning in that lake, do you just not jump in? Do you like what do you do? Like if you're saying somebody's in danger, like why do you just ignore that? Or why do you not at least say, well, let's see if there's actually anyone in the lake. Like let's look,
yeah,
let's have a conversation about this. I just
it is one of the most damning things. And you described, in your previous interviews where you shared more in depth what happened at your previous workplace. It was, the fact that your former boss said, I don't have time to read that article. It's things like this that all these people have gotten swept up in it.
yeah, I had somebody say that what it's going to take is these kids who are medically transitioning right now, detransitioning in the future, and that is like before anything changes. And that thought is so sad. We're just sacrificing a generation of children. Like, that's so sad.
I love sleep. Sound sleep is a crucial foundation of good mental and physical health, from mood and concentration to metabolism and cellular repair. And I sleep very well thanks to my 8 Sleep Pod Pro cover. My side of the bed is programmed to be warm when I get in and cool down to a neutral temperature in the middle of the night so I don't wake up overheated like I used to. How would you customize your bed temperature? Visit 8sleep.com and use promo code SOMETHERAPIST to take up to $200 off your purchase. Even if they're already running another sale, this code will get you an additional $50 off. 8Sleep currently ships not only within the USA, but also to Canada, the UK, select countries in the European Union, and Australia. Thanks for considering purchases that support the show. Well, and Lisa Littman's study found that 3/4 of detransitioners did not inform their former doctors. So how many therapists have rubber stamped people and not even heard back from those same people down the line? I have a template. It's in my usual link in bio, which I'm not sure is in the show notes. It's my, like, if you follow me on social media, anyway, it's bio.site/sometherapist. I believe that there's a shortcut in there. If not, it's on my blog at sometherapist.com/read. But there's a template I have for filing a complaint against the gender-affirming therapist who harmed you for detransitioners. And I was very glad to know, because I feel like a lot of people don't know how to navigate the system. And then we have abuses of the system, like trans rights activists coming after me a couple years ago. I'm sure they're still filing. I'm sure every now and then some new trans rights activist discovers me for the first time and decides to send a complaint to my board. And I don't know if my board at this point is like, oh, another anonymous online trans rights activist filing a complaint about Stephanie Wen. We can go ahead and disregard this. We've already been through this with her. I don't know how often that happens, but you have people who will abuse the system to stop people like you and I from speaking out. So I felt like it was important to say, hey, if the system exists to protect people, let's use it for its intended purposes, and two can play at that game, right? Like there's no reason. I mean, and I know that there's a lot of so-called gender-affirming therapists who their heart was in the right place, and I don't want them all to necessarily suffer. I'm not trying to punish them, but I think we need to use the system, and that there's nothing more powerful than someone who has been harmed as a patient saying, I was harmed and that this shouldn't have happened. And I think, before we started recording, I told you some sort of inside information that I won't share in detail here, but I have reason to believe that some people in positions of power within licensing boards and the lawyers that advise them and so on know that this is all headed for some massive train wreck. And so it's like, I think that every detransitioner who's willing to, it's great when they file lawsuits, and we have like a dozen or so of those in North America right now between the US and Canada, maybe Mexico. But lawsuits are, there's a very small minority of people who are going to work up the courage and find the resources to hire a law firm. I think a much lower hanging piece of fruit for people who were harmed is to complain to licensing boards. And I will even go so far as to say, for those who are listening, you don't just have to be a detransitioner to use a licensing board to complain about gender affirming therapy. If you are a parent who felt like a therapist harmed your relationship with your child or harmed your child, you have every right to use the system, and you are protected in that system. If you go through the system and its board complaint process, your privacy is protected. The board can't do anything to punish you as a consumer for appealing to them for help. Like, you're really protected as a consumer by going to a licensing board. So people might as well, like, you've been dragged through it. I've been dragged through it. Lots of other therapists who have blown the whistle or sounded the alarm about this issue have been dragged through the licensing board process. So you know what? I think our colleagues should have to feel some of what we felt. Again, I'm not trying to punish them, but I'm trying to say we need this to be a fair fight. And right now, those of us who are on this side of the issue saying, hey, we think there's something wrong here, are being unfairly punished, and it's very disproportionate. And meanwhile, there are lists on the internet of hundreds of therapists who have signed an agreement saying, I will affirm people, I will write letters on the first visit, no questions asked. So who's holding them accountable? I think people should be filing complaints about that, and there's no reason why they can't use the system. Well, I think you've said some very wise words on previous podcasts saying like that you're scared and you're sad and you're having all the feelings, but you're not sorry for what you've done. And I thought that was a really powerful
No.
distinction.
Yeah, not at all. Like people, I remember somebody said, "Was it worth it?" And I was like, I don't even know how to answer that question. Like if I saw a burning building and somebody was screaming in there and I ran in, whether I could save the person or not, whether or not I ended up getting burned in the process, like the question isn't was it worth it? Like you do the thing that needs to be done to save the people who are in danger. Like that it wasn't like a thought. You just do the thing that is right to do. Like I don't know, and I don't know why. I don't think I'm an exceptional person, so I don't know why I have that mentality and so many other therapists don't. Like if kids are being harmed, why do we not ask these questions? Like, yes, this road has been scary. Yes, I've lost things. Yes, there's so much that has been hard about this. I don't regret any of it. Even if the state was to take my license, I would say I did the right thing and I am going to let the world know how corrupt the system is because that's wrong. It's just wrong. So I just feel like and I think that for my kids too. I'm like when I feel guilty about the ways that I've impacted my ability to provide for them, I think if my kids were 37 years old or 20 years old and they're like, Mom, I think something is happening at work that's wrong. I don't feel good about it. I would say, you do whatever you need to do to make sure that you're airing your concerns. And if the powers that be try to silence you, then you come talk to me because we need to figure out why that is. Like, there might be something else going on. Like, you always, always, always do what you feel is right, you know? Even if there's repercussions or consequences for that. Always do what you think is right.
That's awesome to hear. And you've been able to think through all of that as somebody with, limited resources and a certain set of obligations and responsibilities. You don't have to share, of course, anything like that you don't want to share with the public, but I'm just curious if you have like a backup plan or how you've been able to sort of reassure yourself that you have options.
Yeah, so I know I'm very grateful. Like when I first lost my job, I was like, even if I have to like lose my house and move back in with my dad, like I still did the right thing. But I'm very grateful that I have been connected with the LGBT Courage Coalition and they set up a Give Send Go for me. And that money is like saving my butt right now. I'm so grateful to everyone who's donated because it's how I'm making ends meet and taking care of my family. Like I was getting unemployment and now the state's coming after me for that. So I might have to pay back thousands of dollars.
Oh,
Like it's
wow.
just been such a headache. And so having that Give Send Go money and just knowing that like, okay, we can keep a roof over our heads while I continue to build up this my caseload with my clients, like it's been incredibly helpful. And I know that any other potential whistleblowers out there with the LGBT Courage Coalition is in place to support them. So I would suggest reaching out to them.
That's
Like
awesome.
there's a safety net of people willing to help.
Yeah, and that was started by Jamie Reed, and she
Yep.
was on a previous episode of this podcast, and I hope to have her back. Maybe we could even do like a group episode with you and her, like a whistleblowers episode.
Yeah, that would be
Um,
awesome.
well, I hope that your private practice thrives. I know you never set out to be in this particular position or even to specialize in this issue. And I can relate to that. I ended up becoming very specialized in this issue, but by nature, I'm a generalist. And, I also saw a wide range of people with a wide range of issues for a long time. But I think for lots of people, lots of just fair-minded, clear-headed people will not necessarily need therapy for anything related to gender, but just know that you are one of the trustworthy therapists out there in Washington State. And I have, as of today, made sure to add you to my own private little referral list. So if I ever get an email, someone looking for a therapist in Washington, you're on that list. And I'll be happy to introduce you to some friends there as well. So yeah, is there anything else that you wanted to say or follow up on from before?
I don't think so. Thank you so much for having me though. It means a lot to connect with other like-minded therapists and just know that like I don't know, like I just came back from the therapy first retreat, and it was so good to like be face to face with other therapists. I was like, these people are so smart and they have such big hearts. And so I just take so much courage from knowing that like there are other really intelligent people who are fighting this fight and caring very deeply about this issue. Like we're not going to give up, you know?
Yeah, that's great. So we'll have your new private practice counseling website in the
Thank
show
you.
notes. We'll also have your Give, Send, Go and the Free Press article. Anything else you wanted to share about where people could find you?
No, I think that sums it up.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast. To check out my book recommendations, articles, wellness products, guest episodes on other podcasts, consulting services, and lots more, visit sometherapist.com. Or follow me on Twitter or Instagram at sometherapist. If you'd like to go deeper, join my community at somekindoftherapist.locals.com. Members can dialogue with other listeners, post questions for upcoming podcast guests to respond to, or ask questions for me to respond to in exclusive members-only Q&A live streams. To learn more about the gender crisis, watch our film, No Way Back, The Reality of Gender-Affirming Care at nowaybackfilm.com. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for our theme song, Half Awake. If you appreciate this podcast and want more people to find it, kindly take a moment to rate, review, like, comment, and share on your platforms of choice. Of course, just because I am some therapist doesn't mean I'm your therapist. This podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. If you need help, ask your doctor or browse your local therapists online. And whatever you do next, please take care of yourself. Eat well, sleep well, move your body, get outside, and tell someone you love them. You're worth it.